in the spring of 1940, with the beaches of Dunkirk still fresh in living memory, and the German army camped along the French coast barely 32 kilometers away. Britain faced a crisis unlike any in its modern history. The country stood almost alone. Its heavy weapons had been abandoned in the mud of northern France. Its armoured reserves were shattered, and the men tasked with defending the southern coastline had, in many cases, nothing more than rifles and a handful of artillery pieces that belonged to a previous war. It was in this desperate, extraordinary moment that a small team of British engineers began seriously revisiting a weapon so violent, so unpredictable, and so genuinely terrifying that it had been quietly shelved for over a century. A weapon built around a spinning metal wheel loaded with rockets, scores of them, that could unleash a wall of fire in seconds. One German soldier who survived an encounter with its predecessor in the Napoleonic Wars wrote simply that the sky itself appeared to be on fire. But here is the remarkable thing. The British who invented this technology, who perfected it, who fielded it in 2 world wars, ultimately decided it was too dangerous for their own men to operate safely. That contradiction between what this weapon could do to an enemy and what it could do to the soldiers firing it is at the very heart of this story. The problem Britain faced in the summer of 1940 was not merely one of numbers, though the numbers were dire enough. The Dunkirk evacuation had saved the men, but left the equipment behind. Estimates suggest the British Army abandoned somewhere in the region of 64,000 vehicles, over 76,000 tons of ammunition, and nearly 2,500 guns on the beaches and roads of northern France. To replace conventional artillery quickly enough to matter was, frankly, impossible. A standard British 25-pounder field gun required skilled foundry work, careful machining, and months of production time even in a fully mobilized factory. Britain had factories. Britain had workers. What it did not have was time. The coastal defences were, in the blunt assessment of several commanders at the time, a fiction. Wooden poles painted to resemble anti-tank guns were photographed for morale purposes. Signposts were removed to confuse any invader, though they confused the defenders rather effectively as well. Against this backdrop, the War Office was prepared to consider almost anything that could put firepower in the hands of inexperienced soldiers quickly and cheaply. And it was in this environment that the projector, infantry, anti-tank, the PIAT, and, more dramatically, the multiple rocket launcher found their moment. The idea of using massed rockets as a battlefield weapon was not new. Sir William Congreve had developed his famous war rockets in the early 19th century, weapons that had seen action at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, at the bombardment of Copenhagen, and most famously at the Battle of Waterloo, where they contributed to considerable chaos on both sides. Congreve's rockets were notoriously inaccurate, a feature, if one is being charitable, rather than a flaw. They were designed not to hit a specific target, but to saturate an area, to set things on fire, and to terrify horses and men alike. By the time of the First World War, conventional artillery had advanced so far in range, accuracy, and rate of fire that rockets had been largely abandoned by every major power. They were a curiosity, a footnote. But in 1940, a team at the Projectile Development Establishment, working under considerable pressure, revisited the concept with entirely modern eyes. What they produced was not a single rocket, nor a simple rack of tubes, but something considerably more ambitious. A rotating launcher that could fire dozens of rockets in a rippling, overlapping sequence, spread across a wide arc, in a matter of seconds. The central mechanism was a wheel, or more accurately, a polygonal metal frame resembling a wheel. onto which individual rocket projectors were mounted at regular intervals around the circumference. When the device was fired, the frame rotated under the force of the rockets themselves, discharging in sequence, creating a sweeping pattern of fire that covered a far wider area than any static launcher of comparable size. The weapon that emerged from this work was known, in its most developed form, as the Z battery rocket projector, and the multiple barrel variants that followed were grouped under the broader program of unrotated projectiles, or UPs, in the dry language of the War Office. The 2-inch UP, designed primarily for anti-aircraft use, fired a rocket trailing a wire with a parachute and small mine attached. The idea was that waves of these devices would create a curtain of dangling explosives through which enemy aircraft would have to fly. It was, in truth, a system of considerable ingenuity and uncertain effectiveness. The ground-based rotating launchers were something else entirely. The basic principle sounds almost medieval in its simplicity. Mount as many rockets as possible on a frame that can be aimed at an enemy position, fire them all within a short window, and let sheer volume of fire do the work that accuracy cannot. Each rocket projectile carried a warhead of roughly 3 kilograms, broadly comparable to a standard mortar bomb, and the launcher frames could accommodate between 12 and 24 rockets, depending on the variant. When the full salvo discharged, the sound was described by everyone who witnessed it as something between a thunderclap and a prolonged shriek. A sustained, physical roar that witnesses said you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The flash was visible at distances of several kilometers. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The manufacturing process was, deliberately, as simple as possible. The rocket motors were produced at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Wrexham and at facilities in Bridgend, using double-base propellant pressed into cylindrical grains. The launcher frames were fabricated from mild steel at engineering works across the Midlands, plants that had previously been making agricultural machinery and domestic ironwork and were now turned to rather more violent purposes. The entire system was designed so that a squad of men with minimal training could assemble, load, aim, and fire it within a few minutes. The accuracy was, by conventional artillery standards, appalling. The area effect was formidable. The operational deployment of these systems followed a particular pattern. They were positioned along likely invasion routes in southern England through the summer and autumn of 1940, operated by units of the Home Guard and by dedicated Z battery detachments of the Royal Artillery. Several batteries were established on the cliffs of Kent and in the flatlands of Essex and East Anglia. In the anti-aircraft role, Z batteries were set up in and around London, Bristol, Liverpool, and other industrial centres, where their ability to put large numbers of projectiles into the sky quickly made them useful supplements to conventional anti-aircraft guns. Records from the London Blitz suggest that Z battery rockets contributed to the downing of at least a handful of German aircraft, though precise attribution in the chaos of a night raid is difficult to establish with certainty. In ground combat use, the nearest documented operational comparison comes not from Britain's home defences, but from the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Katyusha, a weapon developed along remarkably similar conceptual lines at virtually the same time, was employed against German armoured formations with devastating psychological effect. German accounts consistently describe the distinctive sound of massed rocket fire as one of the most demoralizing experiences of the entire campaign. Soldiers who had been shelled by conventional artillery for years reported something qualitatively different about rocket barrages: the duration, the spread, the apparent randomness of the impacts, the sound above all. It was not simply the destruction, it was the helplessness. The comparison with the Katyusha is instructive precisely because it reveals both the strengths and the limitations of the British approach. The Soviet BM-13 Katyusha mounted 16 132mm rockets on a truck-mounted rail launcher. It was mobile, reliable, and fired in a single salvo of approximately 7 to 10 seconds. It was produced in enormous quantities. Estimates suggest over 10,000 units were built during the war, and it was employed en masse, battery after battery firing in coordination to achieve the saturation effect that individual launchers could not. The British rotating launchers, by contrast, were never produced in sufficient numbers to achieve this kind of massed effect. They remained, in operational terms, weapons of defense rather than offensive power projection. And here we arrive at the central irony of this story. The rotating rocket launcher was, in theory, an ideal weapon for the situation Britain faced. Cheap to produce, simple to operate, terrifying in effect, requiring no expertise that could not be taught in an afternoon. In practice, it was deeply hazardous to the men using it. The problem was the backblast. When a rocket motor ignites, it produces a jet of hot gas traveling rearward at enormous velocity. In a single rocket launcher, this can be managed by simply ensuring nobody stands behind it. In a rotating launcher firing multiple rockets in sequence, the arc of discharge meant that the backblast swept around the firing position in a continuous rotation, making it genuinely difficult to position operators safely. Several accidents during training exercises resulted in burns and injuries serious enough that revised safety protocols had to be introduced. And in at least one documented case, a misfire during a live exercise caused a catastrophic secondary ignition of the remaining rockets on the frame, destroying the launcher and injuring several men. The official reports from the projectile development establishment noted these issues with characteristic understatement, describing the backblast hazard as requiring further investigation and the secondary ignition risk as a matter for operational procedure rather than fundamental redesign. In plain language, the weapon worked, but operating it required considerable care. And if something went wrong, it went wrong very quickly and very badly. Germany, for its part, developed its own multiple rocket launchers, the Nebelwerfer series, which avoided the rotating mechanism entirely in favor of static multi-barrel frames firing in ripple sequences. The 15-centimeter Nebelwerfer 41 mounted 6 barrels and could fire a full salvo in 10 seconds. It was more accurate than the British rotating systems, considerably safer to operate, and produced in substantial numbers from 1940 onwards. German soldiers nicknamed the sound of the Nebelwerfer's rockets in flight "moaning minis," a name that told you everything about the psychological dimension of the weapon. The Americans developed the T-34 Calliope, a tank-mounted multiple rocket launcher, later in the war. The Soviet Katyusha remained the definitive expression of the concept. None of them used a rotating wheel. The British approach, whatever its theoretical elegance, did not propagate. The legacy of these weapons is perhaps best understood not in the specific systems themselves, but in what they represented: a wartime willingness to accept unconventional solutions, to reach back into the history of warfare for ideas that had been abandoned, and to ask whether the assumptions of peacetime development still applied when the nation was under existential threat. The rotating rocket launcher never became a decisive weapon of the Second World War. It never produced a turning point battle or a moment of singular historical drama. What it produced, in aggregate, was a measure of reassurance. The knowledge that the beaches and fields of southern England were not entirely naked, that something loud and violent and frightening waited for anyone who came across the channel uninvited. Several examples of Second World War rocket projectors survive in British collections. The Royal Artillery Museum at Larkill holds documentation and components from the Z battery program. The Imperial War Museum in London has associated materials in its archive. They are not glamorous objects. They are rough, functional, utilitarian, metal frames and steel tubes and simple mounting brackets, the products of workshops that had been making something else entirely 6 months before. They do not look like weapons that change the course of history because they did not change the course of history. They look like weapons that were built because history was threatening to change everything else. Return, then, to that spring of 1940, the Channel grey and cold, the coast vulnerable, the factories working night and day to produce, out of ordinary steel and ordinary ingenuity, something that could at least make an invader hesitate. The rotating rocket launcher was not the answer to Britain's problems. It was, perhaps, a symptom of the questions those problems forced Britain to ask, about what a weapon needed to be, about how quickly innovation could be forced, about what risks were acceptable when the alternative was occupation. The British built a wheel of metal packed with rockets that could sweep fire across 100 meters of ground in seconds. They built it knowing it was dangerous. They built it knowing it was inaccurate. They built it knowing that the men who fired it would need to be very careful indeed, and that if they were not careful, the weapon would hurt them before it hurt the enemy. They built it anyway, because sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the room is the one you absolutely need, even if you have to be afraid of it yourself.